We should be live right now. Let me just announce real quick that I'm live on the server. Give me a second. Let me just live. Okay. So basically, ladies and gentlemen, what I'm going to be doing today is I'm going to be responding to a Muslim gentleman who goes along with the name Jake Brancatella, or also the Jake the Muslim metaphysician. And other Catholics also have done a response to this video, but the point of why I'm doing this is, for my first video, I think it's most fitting that uh, I respond to Muslim objections against divine simplicity, because a lot of my works are going to be concerning, divine simplicity, the Trinity, Thomism, and we're also going to speak about the Catholic doctrine and where it's found and the councils. And a couple things to understand before I get into all this is, um you have to uh get to know the person who's responding, which is me, right? I have a speech impediment. I have like a minor stutter, so whenever I stutter or anything, you guys basically know why. It's because I have a speech impediment. So here and there, you'll hear me stutter, but my stutter isn't really it won't really be an issue for when I respond to Jake. Okay. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna pull this up real quick. And if I have to, then I'll appeal to either the Church Fathers or Saint Thomas. Again, if I have to. All right. I think you guys should see my screen now.
Hey, now, wa alaikum everyone.
All right. What's up, Superman? Can you hear the
Welcome
audio?
back. It's Jake, the Muslim metaphysician, and today I'm here to talk to you guys about
Let me know
whether or
if you can hear
not
the audio,
divine
guys.
simplicity is true. Now, people have heard me speak about divine simplicity.
Not to discard this. Yeah, I mean, yes, I can see in here. Awesome. Yeah. I mean, why not, right? I mean, I don't really ascribe to his beliefs, but it's still, still gives the aesthetic. Anyways, so yeah, we're basically gonna go on. We're gonna respond to this video. Very basic, very basic objections against divine simplicity here. Like I'm not taking on like a huge task. These are very simple arguments that we're going to be responding to, and this video will be pretty good if you want some sort of introduction to divine simplicity and what us divine simplicity affirmers say. Basically the Catholic doctrine. So let's just get on with it.
They've heard me mention this terminology in the past. And so I've been getting a lot of questions about divine simplicity. What is it? What does it mean? Do Muslims believe in it? Should we believe in it? All of these kinds of questions. So today, I'm specifically going to be dealing with this question in a bit of depth. I'm going to start off by explaining what divine simplicity is. And so I'm going to give a definition of that and give a little bit of detail about what it actually is. Then I'm going to explain what divine simplicity has meant to the Christian tradition.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm going to explain what divine simplicity has meant in the Islamic tradition.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm going to offer my position on the doctrine of divine simplicity.
Mm-hmm.
And at the end, then I'll kind of summarize the entire lecture and the main points of this video. So I just want to start off by saying that I'm nearing actually 3,000 subscribers on my channel. So I just want to give a shout out to everyone who's subscribed to the channel. Really do appreciate your support. You guys are awesome. Second thing is, I know we only got a couple people watching now because I kind of put this video out last minute or put the stream out with not too much notice. But anybody who's watching now, just if you can give this, really does help this discussion and explain to you guys what the doctrine of divine simplicity is. Now, divine simplicity, when I say that it's a doctrine, what I mean by that is that it is a belief that is held amongst, specifically, it's a position regarding God, okay?
Mm-hmm.
So when we talk about divine simplicity in these discussions, we're referring to the discussion about God and whether or not he is divinely simple.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the knee-jerk reaction is to say, well, maybe, yeah, God is simple. Or some people might think, well, wait, what do you mean by God being simple? Are you saying that he's stupid? No, we don't mean anything like that, God forbid. So what divine simplicity actually is, it has a few key elements to it, a few key thesis statements. And one of these is that God's attributes are identical to one another. Now, what do I mean by that?
Now, before Jake expounds on what he actually means by this, we're gonna get into what we mean by the attributes are identical, because Saint Thomas in his De Potential Dei, or the Summa, for example, he does not say that the names are synonymous to each other, right? So we'll get deeper into it, because Jake didn't really expound on what he meant yet, but I'm just giving the heads up.
God's attributes are things like God's love and God's mercy and God's wrath and God's justice and God's knowledge and God's power, God's will. All of these things are typically, classically speaking, are what we call God's attributes. Now, a central component of the doctrine of divine simplicity states that each one of these attributes that God has are identical to one another. So God's love is identical to his hate. God's mercy is identical to his power. God's justice is identical to his knowledge, and so on. Any attribute you can think of that is properly to be predicated of God is identical to one another.
Again, depends what you mean by that, but we're gonna expound. So I don't want like my viewers watching the stream be like, oh wait, like love is identical to hate, right? Because that would obviously come to pretty stupid conclusions. Love is not identical to hate, right? So we're gonna get into that, like yeah, as I stated earlier.
Now, what do I mean by identical? What I mean by identical is that for two things to be identical to one another, they must be the same thing. So I've given this example before. For example, my real name is Jake Brancatella, but you guys know me on here as the Muslim metaphysician. Now, are these two names or these two things distinct and different? Well, no, they're not, because Jake Brancatella just is the Muslim metaphysician, and the Muslim metaphysician just is Jake Brancatella. These two things are identical to one another. A second example I can give, if you guys are familiar with comics and some of the superhero movies, is there's a famous superhero named Superman. I'm sure you guys, most of you should be familiar with Superman. Now, Superman in the story, in the comics, his name that people know him as, because most people don't know he's Superman, he goes by Clark Kent. That's his real name, Clark Kent. Now, Superman, we would say, is identical to Clark Kent, and Clark Kent is also identical to Superman. Now, what does this actually mean? This means that Superman and Clark Kent are two names that co-refer, meaning that they describe the same person or the same thing, just in the same way that Jake Brancatella is identical to the Muslim metaphysician. A third example I can give you is the author named Mark Twain. Now,
we don't say that the names per se, like they actually are perfect descriptions of the divine essence, like in the same way that analogy portrays it. We say that these names signify the divine essence, but when we speak of love, for example, and I'm just clearing up misconceptions, when we speak of love, we're not saying that we conceptualize the divine essence, because when we speak of the names, instead of saying simply that there's love in God or there's mercy in God, we say that there's something like love, there's something like mercy, right? Because while our analogical predications, right, are merely in time and space, in reality, God's love is something more infinite that human beings cannot rationalize, due to these attributes, these infinite attributes being identical to the divine essence. And us human beings cannot rationalize the divine essence in its fullness. The beatific vision is another video, and I know a lot of direttes or the direttes online will say, oh well, with the beatific vision, you say that you could rationalize. Well, that's not true, but we're going to get into that in another video.
Some people don't know this, but Mark Twain is actually a pen name, or a name that he used that's not actually his government or birth name. His real name was Samuel Clemens. Now, in the same way, these are two names that refer to the exact same person. So Mark Twain is identical to Samuel Clemens. Okay. Now, all of these examples, the Muslim metaphysician and Jake Brancatella, Superman and Clark Kent, Mark Twain and Samuel Clemens, these are all instances of which two names are really identical to one thing. So they're exactly the same. They're just two names to refer to the same thing. So this is what we mean by identity.
Now, Jake is correct, in the sense that these names partake in the same actuality. But it seems like he's describing the names to be some sort of like descriptions of the divine essence in which we could actually conceptualize it, which is not true. But yes, these names partake and in that way they are they are identical in the sense that they partake in the same actuality, and that actuality is God's divine essence. So in that way, they are identical, but they're not synonymous to each other.
Identical. There's no distinction or difference between them whatsoever in terms of content or anything.
Virtual distinction. It has some sort of it doesn't have a full basis in reality because we don't ascribe that it's a real distinction, God forbid, but it's a logical distinction and a name distinction at the same time. So let's say that you're looking, you know, those hallucination things that spin over and over again, right? In reality, um that hallucination is not spinning. Your mind is creating that spin effect. So that would mean that your mind is kind of creating a distinction here, or the hallucination spinning is a mere cognitive predication, right? So through human rationalizing, we are set to actually make distinctions no matter what. No matter what, we will always be making distinctions like in the mind. Like if I were to say that God has attributes, well, I just made a clear distinction between God and his attributes. I did not make a real distinction between God and his attributes. I made a logical and a namely distinction because God and attributes have two distinct names, and um, God and attributes also have distinct meanings. But in reality, God and attributes partake in the same thing. So it's logical and namely at the same time.
So these are all examples, as I said, of two things that are actually one thing because they're identical to each other and they're just names. Okay, so now I'm going to read for you guys a quote. And I'm getting a question here from Aisa saying, is this live? Yes, this is live, guys.
Get the quote, man.
Quickly, if there's any other quick questions. No, so I'm going to try to avoid a lecture and kind of just, I'm just getting back to my notes here. So I explained to you that the key component of divine simplicity, or one of them, is that God's attributes are identical to one another. I gave you an example of what it means for two things to be identical. And I gave those examples. And I gave the examples of what attributes are. So now put those two concepts together, and we understand that divine simplicity says that God's love is identical to God's wrath. God's mercy is identical.
Yeah, so again, for the new people here, when we don't say that God, because I know he's making this sound like very very Irenaeus. We don't say that God's wrath is identical to his love. We say that there's something like love and something like wrath in reality. But in reality, these names are just the power of God or the pure act of God. So these are mere analogical predicates that are positive. They have a basis in reality, but them being in reality, we cannot conceptualize them because as I stated earlier, they are identical to the divine essence, and we can't conceptualize the divine essence because we're creatures.
To his power, in the same sense that Jake Brancatella is identical to the Muslim metaphysician. So these are just two names, God's mercy and God's power, but they don't mean anything different in terms of God. In terms of God and his reality, they're identical to one another. There's no difference, okay? So they're just names. Now, St. Augustine, in the Christian tradition, he was a proponent of divine simplicity. And I'm going to read for you a quote that maybe can help you understand the concept better, and also to show that I'm not straw manning the concept. So St. Augustine said, God, however, is indeed called in multiple ways: great, good, wise, blessed, true, and anything else that seems not to be unworthy of him. But his greatness is identical with his wisdom. He is not great in mass, but in might. And his goodness is identical with his wisdom and greatness. And his truth is identical with them all and with him. So all of these attributes that he's talking about, God's greatness, God's goodness, God's wisdom, God's truth, anything that is properly predicated of God in terms of his attributes, he says they're all identical with one another, and then they're all identical with him. And I'll explain.
They're identical to one another in respect to them being identical to him. Again, it just seems like he's making these weird assumptions, like in reality we believe that they're synonymous. Thomas Aquinas does not say that they're synonymous. Like again, um, and the reason why I keep on repeating these things is that for someone to learn, there has to be repetition. Um, I'm gonna repeat these things so you guys can memorize it.
What that means in just a second.
And we'll go over what Thomas
Likewise, I
Aquinas
have a
says
quote
after
here
this.
from the 17th century English theologian Richard Stock, in which he says, "It appears that, however, these things are attributed to God, that he is love, mercy, favor, and anger. Howsoever they are spoken, as though they were many and different, yet in God they are but one and the same. True it is that we are of a compounded understanding. They are as several things to us because we cannot conceive God as he is. Yet by faith we are brought to believe that there is no such difference between them and God. That which is the love of God is the hatred of God, and that which is his wisdom is his power also, because there is but one and the same essence." So once again, these different attributes are all said to be identical to one another because there is but one and the same essence. Okay, now I'm going to explain to you what that means. Each one of these attributes that I'm speaking of, as I said, are identical to one another, and they likewise are identical to God's essence. So the very essence of who God is, all of these properties or attributes.
And one last implication I'm gonna make. So goodness and wisdom, we don't say that they're synonymous in the sense that goodness does not come forth from wisdom. What goodness comes forth from is the divine essence. Wisdom does not come forth from goodness. Goodness comes forth from, wisdom comes forth from the divine essence. So do you guys get the catch here? They're not identical by mode of being identical to each other. They're identical by mode of being identical to the divine essence. So these analogical predications, they're just not identical to each other. They're not synonymous. They all just partake in the same actuality, which makes them one pure act.
They're all really just one thing, which is God's essence. They're identical to
God. Isn't the divine essence goodness itself? Yes. The attribute of goodness is identical to God's divine essence. We say, like I said earlier, and even Jake Brancatella said it, that we do indeed believe that God's attributes are identical to his divine essence. That's true.
God's essence. Okay. So these are two main components of the doctrine of divine simplicity. First, that God, all of God's attributes that we have classically understood, which I've mentioned, are identical to one another. And second, that all of God's attributes, because they're identical to each other, they're also identical to God's essence and who he is. So it's such so that there's only one essence, and all of these supposed diversities, there is no diversity in God whatsoever. He's a completely simple substance.
Yes.
So those are two main components. A third main component is that God is what's called pure act, or actus purus.
Yes.
There is no potentiality in God whatsoever.
Correct.
Now, what does this mean for God to be pure act? Now, I'm going to read a quote from St. Thomas Aquinas, who's revered and a theologian of the Catholic Church, in which he says this, commenting on this very issue of what it means for God to be pure act, or what's called actus purus. He says, and I quote, "The manifold actions ascribed to God as intelligence, volition, the production of things, and the like are not so many different things, since each of these actions in God is his own very being, which is one and the same thing."
Exactly.
Okay. So let me help and try to flesh this out a little bit. What it means for God to be pure act is that when we say God acts, meaning, let's give an example, that he created the universe. All theists alike agree to this. Okay. God created the universe. Muslims and Christians agree to this.
I know where this is going.
God created the universe. This is an act of God. Now, also, typically in our traditions, we understand that God acts in the world. So, for example, God was responsible for revealing certain things to the prophets, speaking to them. All different kinds of actions are attributed to God. Now, what St. Thomas is saying is that each one of these actions of God are such that there's only one action of God. So each of these actions in God, he says, is his very own being or essence, which is one and the same thing.
Now, the thing is that when Jake Brancatella gives examples of what St. Thomas here means by actions, he starts describing things which God does in space-time. So I'm pretty sure he gave the example of God flooding the earth or something like that. God flooding the earth is not identical to his act. It's the effect of his infinite wrath. So God flooding the earth, for example, is contingent. It's dependent as potentiality. It's a creature that has a logical relation to God's divine essence through his infinite wrath. So we say that they're extrinsic. The when we speak of the effects of his act, they're extrinsic. Ed Fazer talks about this. And for example, when I have a cup, say I have a cup of coffee, and I'm drinking this cup of coffee, and someone walks in and I get scared. The effect of me being scared or being jump scared, my coffee flew over me, right? My coffee spilling everywhere is separate from the initial act of me being jump scared. So the same thing applies, for example, when God floods the earth, when God blesses someone. Because, for example, if God blesses someone, then it's the finite mind making the predication that that was God's love. The same thing goes for God flooding the earth. The finite predication will make the conclusion that that was God's wrath. Again, these are mere analogical predications we're speaking of here. So no, the contingent effect of God flooding the earth is not the best way to describe one of God's acts because they're extrinsic to his intrinsic actions. St. Thomas in context here was speaking of his intrinsic actions.
So God's acts are identical to each other in the sense that there's only one divine act, and that one divine act is identical to his essence, meaning identical to who he is.
Yes.
And so God is so simple that all of his attributes are identical to each other, which are identical to his essence, and God's actions are identical to each other, such so that there's only one divine act, which is also then identical to his essence. And this is what is meant by divine simplicity, because all the things that we think are multiple in God in terms of his attributes and his actions, divine simplicity says, no, this is just from the human perspective. In God, he's so simple, even though it seems multiple, in the sense that all of these things that seem distinct and different are actually identical, such so that there's only one thing in God, and that is God. Okay, so I hope that you guys are following me so far. I'm doing my best to break this down. Honestly, if you're not familiar with the topic, you may have to watch this a couple times, and that's just the reality of it. Now, the second thing that I want to get into, because that sums up my explanation of what divine simplicity is. Now, I want to speak a bit about divine simplicity in the Christian faith and the Christian tradition.
Mm-hmm.
Now, broadly speaking, there are three main sects in Christianity, and I don't mean this as sect as a derogatory term. I'm just saying this is the way that it's classically been categorized. And these three main sects are Catholicism, what's called Eastern Orthodoxy or Orthodoxy, and Protestantism.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm going to explain the position of each one of these sects with respect to divine simplicity. Now, almost unanimously, and pretty much unanimously, Catholics or the Catholic tradition is wedded to divine simplicity, meaning the Catholic theologians affirm divine simplicity.
So yeah, Jake Brancatello, he's definitely saying the truth here. When it comes to divine simplicity, we see it in the Fourth Lateran Council. It's just the major consensus of the saints. Like, it's pretty much dogmatic, and whenever a Catholic or something says that you could be Palamite or something, like, it just doesn't fly with me. You can't be Palamite as a Catholic. That is like one of the most ridiculous things that people say on the internet.
We've heard from the likes of St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, who spoke on divine simplicity. And these are specifically theologians that Catholics affirm, and Catholic Orthodoxy affirms divine simplicity. So it accepts everything that I just explained about divine simplicity mentioned earlier. Now, when it comes to the Eastern Orthodox sect of Christianity, many of Eastern Orthodox deny divine simplicity. And this was one of the breaks or splits between the church, what's called the Church of the East or the Church of the West, between the Catholics and the Orthodox, was on this and what's called the essence-energy distinction. Now, energies is somewhat, just for the sake of discussion, so I don't have to go into much detail about energies, it basically has to do with God's attributes and his actions. And so in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, specifically following Gregory Palamas and what's called the Palamite tradition, the Orthodox make a distinction between God's attributes and actions and his essence. So they say that there's a distinction between those. Now, the Catholics, for the most part, reject this, as we read from the quotes, because they affirm divine simplicity. And they say, no, there's no distinction. They're all the same, because there's no real distinctions in God whatsoever. So we have the Catholics who generally affirm it. We have the Eastern Orthodox who generally deny it or reject it. And then we have the Protestants, which generally speaking are also part of the Western tradition or the Western church. And so for the most part, they followed up the Catholics by speaking about historically speaking, in contemporary Christian analytic philosophy, more specifically. And I would say being conservative within the past 30 Protestants, and you'll find in systematic theology texts, God being simple. The Protestant reformers, so very analytic philosophy being applied to Christian doctrines, have Protestants and the evangelical philosophers in that tradition have, for the most part, rejected divine simplicity. And I'm speaking of the likes of William Lane Craig, even Richard Swinburne.
Yeah, so right now, basically what he's doing is he's saying that there's 3 denominations in Christianity, and one of the reasons why, you know, one of the distinctions in the denominations is that the Catholics affirm divine simplicity, while the Orthodox deny divine simplicity. But he's also saying that the Protestants also deny divine simplicity. The thing is that Protestantism, obviously, they don't have a built magisterium to really determine whether divine simplicity is dogmatic or not, or they have to affirm it or not. So you will find a lot of Protestants who, on the other hand, denies divine simplicity, and you'll find a lot of Protestants who affirms divine simplicity. But yeah, he's making good points, but I'm trying to get to his objections here.
Even though he belongs to the Eastern Orthodox Church, and someone who I just recently had on my channel, Dr. Ryan Mullins. So just a quick recap of divine simplicity in the Christian tradition. Catholics generally affirm it. Eastern Orthodox generally deny it, although some do affirm it. And I just want to try to be as accurate as I can about that. And then most Protestants, up until the past 30 years or so, have affirmed divine simplicity along with the Catholic tradition. And just recently have some Protestants, such as William Lane Craig, Ryan Mullins, and others, began to reject divine simplicity because it's gone over. We've gone over what divine simplicity actually is. Watch the video, or maybe rewind it to the beginning and watch from the beginning. And that feature is available on YouTube if you guys don't know that, even while the video is playing live, so you can go back to the beginning. And then I just also explained divine simplicity, about divine simplicity in the Islamic tradition and what the Muslim theologians have said about it in the past. So once again, guys, if you're watching this stream, we got 21 people here.
Honestly, I do not really care what the Muslims say about the tradition. I'm just trying to get to your objections here.
Termed divine simplicity, whereas the
Sunni Muslims.
Then the other group, if those who are familiar with the Sunni and the Shia, famously rejected absolute divine simplicity.
Accept it, yes.
Because I already explained what divine simplicity is. So I'm sorry about that. Now, some points will be rehashed, but I'm not going to go back and start over again. Now, the question is, why has mainstream Sunni Islam rejected divine simplicity? Now, there are a few key reasons. The first reason is that divine simplicity is incompatible with the description of Allah in the Quran wa Sunnah. Okay. Now, why do I say that? Because that's a very strong claim. The reason why I say that is because the Quran wa Sunnah presents Allah. Allah is Ar-Rahman. The Quran wa Sunnah presents Allah as having multiple real attributes that are not identical to one another. Okay, so that's a
bunch of parts. Anyways,
the first problem is because divine simplicity says, no, these are all just names, but in reality, they're all identical to one another and they're identical to God's essence. We do not say that. The Sunni tradition does not make this claim. So based on our scriptures, which are the Quran and the Sunnah, it presents God as having multiple real attributes. Okay, now here's a point of difference, but that will help you understand how this is the case and how.
Yeah, keep in mind, guys, he's speaking to a Muslim audience here, so bear with me.
Those who are familiar with the controversies amongst, for example, the divide in certain instances between the Ash'aris and Maturidis on the one hand, and the Atharis or the Salafis on the other hand, on things like Allah's hands or Allah's face, and what we would call what appears like the anthropomorphic, whether or not Allah's hands or his yad between the Ash'aris and Maturidis on the one hand, all of the attributes are exactly the same. It's not just that Allah's hands is identical to his power, his to his. Okay, and I'm going to stay out of the debate because Allah, without any can go to the scholars like these recommend looking at If divine simplicity was assumed, there would be no discussion about these attributes of Allah's hands and whether or not they're reduced from things like his power and his majesty or whatever, whether or not they are distinct attributes or it's just a name for the same attribute like God's power. It's about whether or not you reduce what looks like the anthropomorphic attributes to the more what's called rational attributes. Okay. Now, like I said, I'm not going to get into that debate. I'm just explaining it so that the second point, the Quran wa Sunnah presents Allah as having multiple real attributes. Now, the second point, this is where it's going to get a bit more technical, but I think a bit more demonstrable as to why the Sunnis have classically rejected divine simplicity and what is seriously wrong with the doctrine and why it is incompatible with the Quran wa Sunnah. And the second point on this is that it's inconsistent with the Quranic claim that the universe had a beginning and it is not eternal. So the Quran presents Allah as creating the universe,
okay, here we go.
and whether you think it's the Big Bang or whatever, it doesn't matter to me. But latest science tells us that time, space, matter, and energy began with the Big Bang.
Go on.
And so the Quran is actually saying that the universe had a beginning and it was not eternal.
Yes,
that Allah
I
is
agree.
eternal. He is the only being that is eternal, and he existed alone by himself and created the universe. Okay, whether you think it's 14 point something billion years ago or whatever, it's fine, doesn't matter. But that's the Quranic model and picture.
That's the Christian model too. We don't believe that the universe is eternal. What the hell? We believe that St. Thomas says this in his Summa. He says that whatever is uncreated is the divine essence. So he also makes this argument with the relations, for example. He would say that these relations are not accidents due to the fact that they're uncreated. Because if they were created, they would be accidents, because anything that is created would have potentiality to it, or it would be contingent or have some sort of dependence. And he says that the first cause or the first unmoved mover has no contingency because he's pure act. So yeah, he makes this argument, and Palamas disagrees with this, that anything that's uncreated is God, like is identical to God's essence. But in our paradigm, anything that is uncreated, it is identical to his essence. So yeah, just needed to put that out there.
Now, here's what I want to go back to.
Now, what, by the way, sorry for pausing again, but what he's going to get into right now is he's going to try to use the argument of modal collapse, because what he just said is that divine simplicity implies that the universe is eternal, or that creation is eternal. But we don't, I mean, like unless say you're like one of these weird Shias or something, like, we don't affirm that. So me as a Thomist, I deny that premise.
Divine simplicity. Why is divine simplicity incompatible with the universe or creation having a beginning in time and not being co-eternal alongside God? Why is that the case? Now, here's the argument. If God's acts, which we discussed before is a component of the doctrine of divine simplicity, if God's acts are identical to one another, such that there is only one divine act, and that divine act is identical to God's essence, and God's essence is eternal, then this would make his one act eternal. So let me just make sure you guys are following me so far. Divine simplicity says that all of God's attributes and his actions are identical to one another, such that his acts are really only one act, and that one divine act is identical to his essence. And I quoted some scholars earlier that were proponents of divine simplicity that explicitly said this. You can do the research and you'll see the same thing. Okay. So if God's act, he only has one act, let's call it creation for the sake of discussion. His one act of creation is identical to his essence, and his essence is eternal, then that would mean that his one act, because it's identical to his essence and his essence is eternal, that one divine act would therefore then also be eternal. What would this mean? That if God's one act of creation is eternal, that would mean that God's that creation would be co-eternal alongside God.
Okay. So here's the issue. This is basically just modal collapse reworded. What modal collapse says is that if God's attributes are identical to his essence and eternal, and God has the action of creation, which we say that the action of creation is identical to the divine essence, then that would lead to creation also being eternal and also being the divine essence, since it would be identical to God's action, which is also the divine essence. Now here's the problem. Again, as I said earlier, we make a separation from God's initial act and God's effect of the act itself. So let me use the analogy I used earlier, right? So let's say that I have a let's say I have a cup of coffee, and I'm drinking this cup of coffee, and someone walks in and he jump scares me, right? The effect of that person jump scaring me while I have this coffee in my hand is that the coffee splashes everywhere. Now the thing is that me getting jump scared, which is the initial act, and me splashing the coffee everywhere has a separation to it. Right? Because the initial act was me being jump scared, and the effect of that act was the coffee splashing everywhere. So the same thing goes for God and creation. God creates, right? God's initial scope of him creating is identical to the divine essence, while the effect of the act is what is contingent, created, potential, right? You could knock yourself off by naming all of the the acts which are extrinsic from God's divine essence. They are contingent, and they are uh what gets into change. um so yeah, this is basically a little sum down of what we say. Ryan Mullins makes the same argument, so let's continue.
And this is one of the reasons that a famous Ash'ari, Imam Ghazali, repudiated the philosophers, because this doctrine is incompatible with the Quran wa Sunnah and the notion that the universe was eternal alongside God. Because people, the philosophers,
Again, Modal collapse gives a erroneous conclusion. It doesn't conclude that the universe is eternal or that the universe is co-equal with God. That's just a very erroneous, fallacious conclusion of false presuppositions.
generally speaking, and those who affirm divine simplicity, if you take it to its logical conclusion, okay, it results in the universe being eternal. So if you look where this, and here's an interesting point, where did this doctrine of divine simplicity come from? And don't get me wrong, this is not a genetic fallacy, because I'm not going to say it's wrong because it had its origins in pagan Greek philosophy, but I'm going to explain a story and history so you understand the connections. Divine simplicity has its origins in pagan Greek philosophy.
Wrong. This is a very common, very common claim that, and the Eastern Orthodox make the same claim, that the people that we first originate divine simplicity in are these pagan philosophers. For example, Aristotle. Aristotle is someone who expounds on Actus Purus in a very good way, and Saint Thomas and the Church Fathers took this this explanation from Aristotle, and they put it into the Christian doctrine so that we can reconcile, right? Since Aristotle gave an excellent argument for the the existence of God, right? So we see divine simplicity in a lot of Jewish sources, like way before Aristotle even existed. And this is why the Jews in the first place ascribed to divine simplicity, due to the fact that it was actually passed down by their earliest rabbis. Essentially, because scripture teaches divine simplicity. God says, I am who I am. God says that, it says in scripture that God is love. So these rabbis take these interpretations. Well, not the God is love, because God is love is from the New Testament, but from the Tanakh. When God says, I am who I am, the rabbis interpret this to say that God is just one power. He's literally just one pure act. So yeah, let's continue.
And even those who affirm divine simplicity in the Christian tradition and the Mu'tazila and the Shia and the philosophers, they would not deny this. And the philosophers, it's obvious. There's people like Ibn Sina and Ibn.
I will deny this. The universe is not eternal. None of the fathers, none of my saints teach it, and the conclusion of modal collapse does not follow, as I presented earlier.
They were huge followers of people like Aristotle and even Neoplatonic thinkers and things like that, Plotinus. So the issue is that because it has its origins in pagan Greek philosophy, in people like Aristotle and Neoplatonism, of people like Plotinus, this is the reason why its core is incompatible with Islam. Because these people didn't have the Islamic tradition.
Yeah, so what the Muslims say is that they don't adhere to Greek philosophy because Greek philosophy will come to erroneous conclusions, blah, 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 right? So the thing is that whenever you make these deductions, these arguments for God, for example, you're gonna have it's self-defeating essentially because you're gonna have philosophical presuppositions in the first place. So, for example, with scientism, and Ed Fezer explained this in his books on, I'm pretty sure it was Scholastics, right? He says that scientism is self-defeating due to the fact that you don't conclude the basis of reality through science itself. The way that we know science is true, for example, is through philosophical presupposition. You must deduce that science is the way which we could get to the basis of reality. And you cannot deduce that from science alone. You must deduce that from logic, meaning that it's self-defeating. You will always have philosophical presuppositions. And just because we see these Greek philosophers who are pagan expound on these philosophical presuppositions in a way that could help people doesn't mean that, for example, St. Thomas deriving from Aristotle makes him like this bad guy who just had like these weird Hellenistic beliefs, like Jay Dyer says, right? That's not how it works, because for like then you would be dismissing what the Latin fathers taught. You'll say that St. Augustine had these weird Hellenistic presuppositions. You'll say that St. Hilary had these presuppositions. You'll say that Ambrose had these presuppositions. It just goes on and on. It's just a very erroneous claim.
Tradition or faith in mind when they were coming up with these philosophies and systems about who God is. So they had no idea of even trying to make it compatible with the religion of Islam, or even Christianity for that matter, because I would say it's incompatible with Christianity also on a basic level, especially when it comes to things like the Trinity. But that's a whole nother can of worms. But those who affirm divine simplicity, typically, if you go back to people like Aristotle, have affirmed that the creation was co-eternal alongside God.
Nope.
And it wasn't even a creation by a God's will in that sense. It was almost like a necessary emanation of what you find in Neoplatonism.
No. I mean, he's just pretty much repeating himself. That doesn't follow. That just doesn't follow.
Okay. And this is not what is affirmed in the Quran wa Sunnah. This is not the understanding of the prophets and what we've been passed down to through our sacred texts. Okay. And you have to understand, I'm not going out here trying to bash Aristotle and these people. I think they're totally wrong about divine simplicity. Okay. But one of the reasons I'm bringing this up is so that you understand that where the doctrine came from, and to demonstrate why I'm saying that the creation or the physical universe being co-eternal alongside God goes hand in hand with divine simplicity. And it's evident by those who actually were responsible for furthering the doctrine. They all pretty much held that position. Okay.
No,
now, again, just to reiterate the argument, if God's acts are identical to each other, so that God only has one divine act, and that one divine act is identical to God's essence, and God's essence is eternal, then that would mean that God's one act would be eternal, which means if his one act was creation, that means creation would be eternal alongside God, and this is antithetical to Islam and our tradition. Okay?
Yeah. Okay. So like I already responded to this, and if you guys want to see my response to modal collapse, you could just go back like 15 minutes or something. I forgot, but this video will be up for rewatch. But if you actually go earlier back in Jake's video, the way he describes God's acts in the context of St. Thomas, for example, he described it specifically as God flooding the earth. Now, of course, my main issue is that the God flooding the earth is not an intrinsic act. We're speaking about intrinsic acts here. We're not speaking about acts which are separate from the divine essence. So, God flooding the earth is a contingent act, or a, I know people don't like this term, but Cambridge property, which is not the divine essence. It's the effect of the divine essence, which is extrinsic. Um, so yeah, like you have to keep in mind here, Jake. When Jake makes these arguments, he has a false assumption on what acts we say are identical to the divine essence or not, because the way he described it is just not the Thomistic belief. Um, I just want to throw that out there. So
that's the first point. That's the second point on what the problem with this doctrine is. Okay. I'm being told I'm committing a genetic fallacy, but dear brother Mir, I want you to look up what the genetic fallacy is. The genetic fallacy says that a position is wrong. You use an argument to say that a position is wrong because of where it originated from. I never said that. I never said that divine simplicity was wrong because it came from pagan Greek philosophy. What I said was, this is where it came from. This is what also those same people who believed in divine simplicity also believed, which was that the universe was eternal alongside God.
yeah, that's literally a genetic fallacy. I don't know why you're trying to dismiss that fact, because for example, let's grant that Aristotle did believe that the universe is co-eternal with God. Let's just grant that. And this, of course, will be erroneous because Aristotle believed in one unmoved mover. So, anyways, let's just grant that. Right. So that is a false assertion made by the philosopher. But if a philosopher has truth which he speaks, then I'm going to ascribe to that truth which the philosopher speaks. Now, you're saying that since this philosopher had this distinct belief in him that is false, then that would just collapse the whole doctrine. That's what genetic fallacy is. You're saying that just because Aristotle had this distinct belief from him believing in that God is actus purus, that somehow that would collapse my doctrine, because Saint Thomas does not believe in every little thing that Aristotle does. So he doesn't have pagan presuppositions because he believes in Christianity, and simply what he did was implement um he simply just he simply just implemented Aristotle's idea of actus purus into Christianity so we could be reconciled. But this belief was always in the church fathers, and that's what people don't understand. Because when you assert divine simplicity, you assert that God is one pure act, as Saint Ambrose taught, right? You'll see throughout the church fathers, they teach that God is one act, that God is one continuous movement. That's exactly what they say.
And I only brought that up to show that my argument for trying to explain that it results in a universe being eternal alongside God is accurate, or does have merit to it. But you don't even have to take that, because my argument alone of anybody who knows anything about identity, that if two things are identical to one another such that they're the same, then that means they can't differ in any way as per Leibniz's law. Because if there's any difference between them, then it can't be identical per classical identity through Leibniz's law. Okay? So by Leibniz's law, if two things are identical to one another, then they must have all the same properties and cannot differentiate between them whatsoever. Okay? So if God's one act is identical to his essence, and his essence is eternal, then it follows by identity that his one act of creation would be eternal, which would mean that his act of creation is eternal alongside God. Okay, so
Yeah. So if you're new here, I'm not sure how much new people have arrived, but if you go back, basically what Jake has been doing for the past 20 minutes is he's been repeating the same argument, which is modal collapse. I respond to modal collapse. Just go back. Um, Basically, he just produces an erroneous conclusion, and he just keeps on forcing this erroneous conclusion on the Christian belief, and that's just fallacious. So let's just
Third
go.
point, and here's one of the biggest points, is that divine simplicity is inconsistent with Allah having free will. Now, why do I say that? Because that's another big claim, and I'm going to break it down. I'm going to explain it.
Mm-hmm.
Going back to what I just said. And I'm presenting this argument in its most simplest form, so don't get so nitpicky with me, okay? Because I can present it in much more detail, but I'm trying to break this down as simply as I can for a lay audience who's not familiar, who's probably not so familiar with the subject, okay? So the third point is that it's inconsistent with God having free will. Now, why I say that? Now, once again, if God's one act is identical with his essence, which is not only eternal, which we went over before, but also necessary,
It must
then
be
his one
necessary.
act is not only eternal, but it is necessary. Okay? Now, what do I mean by it's necessary? This means that God couldn't have done otherwise and therefore has no free will.
Mm-hmm.
Once again, this is what's called a modal collapse in God. Now, what is a modal collapse?
Now you bring it up.
Modality in logic refers to categories of necessity and contingency. Now, what does necessity mean? Necessity means it couldn't have been any other way. It's logically impossible for it to have been any other way. It had to be the way that it is. Contingency is the opposite of that. Contingency says that it is the way it is, but it didn't have to be the way that it is. It could have been otherwise. So it's not necessary. Now,
okay, so this is another form of modal collapse. They say that since God's essence is necessary, and if the act of God creating is also identical to the divine essence with which the essence is necessary, then this would lead to God's decision or God's will to create deemed necessary, mean that God does not have free will. Now, one of the big things in this objection is that this objection is comparing finite free will and infinite free will. And what do I mean by this exactly? So finite beings have potentiality. We have we go from potency to act, whereas God is pure act, meaning that his free will to do things, for example, is different than our free will to do things, because God does not change. God is free from potentiality, as St. Thomas says in his works. And this also puts God in a kind of in a like weird genus, like in a weird composed area, that God kind of just like, he's outside of space and time, he's spatially in one area, and he just randomly thinks one day, you know what, I'm just gonna create the world because why not? No, that's not how God's decisions work. Ultimately creating, which, as I stated earlier, creating, which what really has potentiality, is the effect of the act of creating. So there's no potentiality here because the act is distinct from the effect. And in reality, this act of creating is just the power of God. When you think of it like this, that the act of creating is literally just the power of God, then no other conclusions could be sought. Because we don't say that it's the initial act that changes. We say it's, like I said earlier, it's the effect that changes. So you just place God in this weird composite form as if he has like these weird finite characteristics of thinking, or like we do. That's not how God's free will works. Like literally simple as that. That's the huge presupposition of the argument, and the same thing applies to the other modal collapse argument, the simple one that it leads to eternal creation.
divine simplicity results in what's called the modal collapse of these two categories, necessity on the one hand and contingency on the other. Divine simplicity results in collapsing these two categories into one category, and thereby making everything necessary in a radical sense, to make everything necessary in God such that he would have no free will.
It doesn't
Now, what's a
follow.
demonstration of this in its simplest terms? As I just said, once again, if it's a key component of divine simplicity, that all of God's acts are identical to each other, such that there's only one divine act, because if there's more than one divine act and they're distinct from one another, then God wouldn't be simple, because there would be distinction.
Guys, keep in mind, I will say this again. Keep in mind that when Jake speaks of these acts, He doesn't even have a right conception of the intrinsic acts. He doesn't have, he has, it's just full of false presuppositions. He doesn't have the right idea of what we mean by God's acts are identical to his essence.
Real distinctions within God. So that's why it's a fundamental part of divine simplicity to affirm that all of God's divine acts are really identical to each other, such that there's only one divine act, and this one divine act is identical to his essence. And God's essence, classically speaking, even amongst the proponents of divine simplicity, is that God's essence is identical to his existence.
Mm-hmm.
And his existence is necessary and eternal. So his essence and his existence are necessary and eternal. That's a key classical understanding of who God is, even amongst the proponents of divine simplicity. Now, if God's one act is identical to his essence and his essence is necessary and eternal, then not only would his one divine act be eternal, but it would also be necessary. And if his one divine act is necessary, then it means that God could not have done otherwise. If God could not have done otherwise, and his one divine act of creation is necessary, then God does not have free will. If God does not have free will, then he's not God. Plain and simple. And once again, the Quran wa Sunnah rejects this, and it says that out of everything that exists, God is the most free being. God is radically free to do as he pleases.
We also need to discuss what is necessary absolutely or necessary by supposition. So, for example, it's not absolutely necessary that I create this live of me responding to Jake on these issues. Right? But by supposition, I am actually live right now responding to Jake the Muslim metaphysician. So similarly, when it comes to God, it is not absolutely necessary that God wills to create the world, of course, but on supposition that he has the will to create it. So keep that in mind, okay? There's a supposition and absolute necessary distinction.
So that we have to understand this. Now, if on the one hand, why divine simplicity is actually internally incoherent is because it claims that God has free will, and at the same time claims that God is divinely simple. But if God is divinely simple, he can't have free will. Therefore, divine simplicity has an internal contradiction within it. Secondly, divine simplicity has an external contradiction within it, because both in the Christian scriptures and the Islamic scriptures, the Quran and Sunnah, God has free will. This is a fundamental point about God, that he has free will. If you deny that God has free will, then it's not Allah. It's not the God of the Quran. It's not even, I'm even defending Christianity and Judaism. It's not the God of the Bible, because the God of the Bible has free will in some sense. Okay. So once again, when I say modal collapse, it collapses the categories of necessity and contingency such that everything becomes necessary, and God's act of creation is necessary.
Yeah, I'm just gonna repeat myself one more time, because for some reason, like Jake has literally been making the same points over and over again, like after I keep on pausing the video. But again, there's a distinction between something being absolutely necessary and something being necessary by supposition. So I made a analogy earlier. If you're paying attention, you would know. So yeah, no Muslim rejects divine simplicity. You don't reject the fact, I mean, obviously you don't believe that God is composed, or that God has parts, like just a bunch of parts. But in context, when I speak of divine simplicity, I'm just saying that God is actus purus, and that God is identical to his attributes. God is identical to all his acts. And yeah, I'm pretty sure in the Ash'arite paradigm, you guys have a very different understanding, because you guys don't say that the divine simplicity is the negation of composition. But when we speak of divine simplicity in the paradigm of the Catholics, the Jews, it's way more complex than just saying that God is not composed. So yeah.
and eternal, because his act is identical to his essence. And remember that God's essence has to be necessary and eternal, because that's a fundamental doctrine of God, that God
Yes,
is a
correct.
necessary existent and that he is eternal. You don't want to say that God's existence or his essence is contingent, nor do you want to say that it's it's not necessary, and nor do you want to say that he's not eternal. Because once again, if we're talking about a contingent God that is not eternal, this is not God. This is not the God of the Quran. This is not even the God of any rational person, to be honest with you. So once again, the three main reasons that I gave for why mainstream Sunni Islam has pretty much unanimously rejected divine simplicity is because it's incompatible with the Quran wa Sunnah, in the sense that the Quran wa Sunnah presents Allah as having multiple real attributes: his love, his mercy, his justice, his knowledge, his wisdom, and they're not identical to one another. And we know this from even intra-Sunni debates, otherwise, like about Allah's hands and power. This wouldn't even be a discussion if they were the proponents of divine simplicity. And so the Quran wa Sunnah in a straightforward reading presents Allah as having multiple real attributes that are not identical to one another, as divine simplicity says. The second point, which I went over, is the Quranic claim that the universe had a beginning. And we know this also from philosophy.
I honestly do not care about the Quranic belief. Does he
Because
have
of
any
the
other objections?
also, we even know it from modern day science, was the only eternal being. As I was just reiterating before, that divine simplicity is incompatible with Islam, because Islam says
Don't care.
Perfect being theology and comparing gods. If my God has free will and yours doesn't, I think my God is obviously more perfect and better than yours.
What the hell? That was the most that was so like that was so immature. My God is better than yours. Like, dude, you realize that your argument just gave a erroneous like, it does not lead to God not having free will. You just have false presuppositions to your argument. Um that's hilarious though.
So Allahu Akbar.
So Allahu Akbar.
And then the last point that I want to go over is a phrase that's commonly heard in standard Sunni Aqidah or Sunni Creed. And this is that we say Allah's attributes are not him, nor are they other than him.
Yes, okay. That was my point. I'm pretty sure the Asharites also they also adhere to this, that the relation between the attributes and the divine essence are that the attributes are not other than the divine essence, but they also are not the divine essence itself. Now, I'm not sure where Jake is gonna go with this. If he ends up stop critiquing divine simplicity, then we're just gonna we're just gonna end it here and give conclusions of his video.
And this is somewhat related, but I just want to briefly touch on this. And this is the last thing I'm going to touch on. Now, what does this phrase mean? Is this incoherent, as some claim? Because some people claim, well, if the attributes are not him and they're not other than him, well, then that violates the law of excluded middle. Because what are they? What are they then? If they're not him or they're not other than him? But no, you have to understand it contextually and what it actually means. Okay. Now, given my explanation of divine simplicity and the rejection of it in standard Sunni Aqidah, we understand, or I'll explain to you, that the first part of the phrase, the attributes of God are not him, is a rejection of divine simplicity. So they're not God in the sense that they are not identical to God. They don't exhaust his being and who he is. Okay? Now, the second part of the phrase, nor are they other than him, means that we reject divine simplicity because they're not identical to God, but they are not completely separate and distinct from him either. These attributes, okay, they're not other than him because they're not identical. They're not him because they're not identical to him. But the second part, that they're not other than him, is because they're not separate and distinct from Allah. They subsist and adhere in him and cannot be separated from him.
They are not distinct. Like, I don't know if that was a mistake in his words. They are not distinct or separate from Allah. So if they're not distinct or separate, then what are they? But I'm just playing around because I know that wasn't what he meant. But the thing is this is a separate topic for another video. But when you ascribe distinctions, right, you'll say that the distinctions don't entail separation. Now, when we speak of I'm specifically speaking in the Thomistic paradigm, is that any absolute distinction, so any distinction that is absolute, entails composition. Because any absolute distinction entails contingent faculties. or it will lead to composition, which is a contingent faculty. So people will say, okay, then why do you affirm distinctions within the Trinity? Which is actually going to be the topic of my next video. We're going to give a complete. We're basically going to talk about the Trinity and divine simplicity, and how the Trinity and divine simplicity are completely compatible with each other. We don't ascribe absolute distinctions to God's relations. So we don't say that God's relations are absolutely distinct. We say that they're relatively distinct. And St. Thomas explained this in his De Potentia Dei. He says that the persons are not absolutely distinct, because if the persons were absolutely distinct, then this would lead to a distinction in his divine essence. But obviously, as a divine simplicity affirmer, you can't say that there's a distinction within his divine essence, because then that would obviously um, that would obviously contradict divine simplicity. But when it comes to these immanent relations, which are relatively distinct by mode of procession, which are proper to the persons to themselves and not the divine essence, then no distinction occurs in the divine essence, since these these origins are only proper to the persons themselves, and they're not distinct by absolute distinction, but by a relative distinction, or a imminent distinction.
Okay, so this is an explanation of standard Sunni Aqidah on the issue of God's attributes and how it relates to his essence. And maybe I'll do a further video on this at some point of explaining in detail actually what it is. Now I'm just going to briefly kind of scroll through the comments, see if there's anything. If you guys have any, because this is the end of the address or the initial portion of the discussion. If you guys have any questions directly related to the stream that I didn't address or do you want clarification on, please post them now, especially as a super chat if you'd like to support the channel, because there are a lot of comments going on in the chat right now. So if you want to get it answered, posting it as a super chat would be preferable and also helpful to supporting the channel. So let me just see here if we have anything interesting before I close. Just bear revealed about himself in the Quran and the Hadiths. It is revealed himself. Otherwise, you're just making an assumption. I'm not making an assumption.
I believe in anything about God, what he revealed. Yeah. So now he's just doing like a Q&A. So that's basically the end of his critique. So let's stop screen sharing here. So what is the conclusion of this video by Jake the Muslim Metaphysician? The conclusion is that Jake gave false Irenaeus. He gave a syllogism, and the two syllogisms were modal collapse and how it leads to eternal creation, and then another sense of collapse, which leads to God having no free will. Both have Irenaeus conclusions, and what Jake the Muslim Metaphysician did is he applied these Irenaeus conclusions, and he literally just slapped it on Christianity. He slapped it on Christianity. He said that there's no way out of this, as if it's a irrefutable argument, and as if people were not making this argument for centuries and centuries. Okay? And as if my philosophers didn't respond to these arguments. Anyways, so my next stream will be about, like I said earlier, how we reconcile the Trinity and divine simplicity. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope you guys learned from this. Please, critique how I teach things. Please, my Discord is always open if you have any questions. I hope you guys enjoyed the stream. God bless, and may God be with you.